The crimes, the criminals, why did they do it? Who got hurt? Did they meet justice or commit the perfect crime? You'll find all the clues at Jim Harold's Crime Scene. Welcome to the Crime Scene. I am Jim Harold. So glad to be with you once again. Now, I love these looks into organized crime, but sometimes there's a certain sameness that sets in. Well, not this time. We are going to talk about the recent book, and I believe it's maybe a motion picture one day, White Devil, the true story of the first white Asian crime boss. And we have the perfect guest on the line, the author of the said book, Bob Halloran. He is a news and sports anchor at WCVB-TV, the ABC affiliate in Boston. And he has also been awarded a New England Emmy Award for sportscasting, as well as 2 honors from the Associated Press. And he has this very successful book and interesting, and we're so glad to have him with us. Bob, welcome to the program today.
Thank you very much.
What piqued your interest in this case?
Well, it started with that little hook of a white guy joining a Chinese gang, and he had to learn to speak Chinese in order to, get himself into the gang, to get along with everybody, and to ultimately rise to second in command, is about as high as he got. And with that, your interest is piqued, I think, right away, because that's a very uncommon thing. And then secondly, I think it was the opportunity to speak with John Willis, that's who we're talking about. He's in prison in Cumberland, Maryland, and I had an opportunity to go down and talk to him over 2 days, and then a lot of email exchanges. And I think having that opportunity to interview and try to understand how a 15-year-old boy growing up in Dorchester, Massachusetts, otherwise normal and playing hockey and living his life, all of a sudden gets himself down a very different path. And so it was interesting to talk with John and to try to understand him. And I tried to put that into the book, my amateur psychology and whatnot, trying to just figure him out and letting him tell his story as much as possible.
And then that was going to be one of the things I asked about, this idea of when we look at organized crime, or someone who turns to a life of crime, as it were, we kind of think, well, what drove them to that? What kind of demons? Were they abused? What's the backstory? Why did they go down that path? What was John's story? Why did he choose to go down this path?
Well, this is his story, and I don't, agree with it or 100% buy into it, because it happens to a lot of kids. His father left when he was 3 years old, and his mother passed away when he was 15. So he was orphaned at the age of 15. He didn't have a whole lot of family support at that stage. He did have a couple of older sisters who were much older and out on their own, and married and whatnot, and they didn't seem to help as much as they could have. There were others, cousins and whatnot, but there weren't a whole lot of safety nets for him. So he started by getting a job at a Burger King. He did some other things. He was into steroids by then, and was a bouncer in a bar by the time he was 16, lying about his age. And he could have certainly gotten his high school education or a GED or different things like that, but the longer story is that there was a night at a bar where he helped break up a fight, Asians, and one of the guys handed him a card and said, "Thanks, white boy. If you ever need any help, give me a call." And he handed him a business card. And so at one point, John called that number and got picked up by several Asian people in a car and brought to a house, and all of a sudden he's part of this group. And they trusted him and showed him the way they were doing things, and they were working for the gang leaders in Chinatown here in Boston. And so all of a sudden he's going down that path. But again, it has to be part of his own makeup. that he's okay with the idea that they're going to commit crimes, that they're going to commit violence, and that's essentially what his job became in the early going. Was he was a bit of an enforcer and a collector, and that's something that I think if you grabbed 100 kids with a similar circumstance and the same backstory, 99 of them say, I don't want to do that. So somehow or another, John was okay with it, and also okay with the fact that he was good at it. And he is quite egotistical in a good way, rightfully so. He's quite proud of himself that he was able to learn Chinese, which I think speaks to his intelligence, and that he was able to organize and effectively take over and then go down his own criminal path and escape the Chinese gang that he was in, but kind of run his own gang, which ultimately got him caught and sent to prison.
Now, I think it's fair to say that the Asian community in general tends to be tight-knit. So for him to break through and achieve this kind of status seems to me to be pretty remarkable. I mean, what was it that is and was unique about him that allowed him to do that, where I would think that most people would just be rebuffed, I would think?
Yeah, he would tell you that he was quiet in the beginning and unassuming and very respectful. And because he respected them, they also respected him. He didn't tell any stories of having to prove himself or one of the gang members not trusting him or being upset that this guy was involved. I mean, his story is so fast. The night he was picked up, he had dinner at this house with 10, 15 Asian people, including women and children. And the next day, he was brought into Chinatown to a restaurant where a lot of the meetings were being held. And he met the boss and was sent out with others to get the right clothes. And they did some shopping, and they paid for his clothes. And all of a sudden, he was just hanging out. So I don't know that at that point you'd say he's in the gang, but he was definitely hanging out with them. And then over time, he was given chores and responsibilities and sent down to New York. That's a big part of the story, I guess, that it was almost like, a transfer. He was here in Boston, and they sent him down to New York to learn a little bit more about what he's supposed to do. And that's where he started to Chinese and went to karaoke bars and tried to meet women, and if he's going to meet women, he needs to speak their language. And so he used flashcards and talked with his gang members, and they would help him with words and whatnot. So, and then after about a 2-year apprenticeship in New York, he was brought back to Boston and kind of sat at the right hand of the leader of really the only gang that was in existence at that point. Many of the others had kind of like fallen away, but the Ting-On gang was still kind of running things in Chinatown, and he was at the right hand of Bai Ming, who was the leader at that time.
One of the interesting things, and you touched on it earlier, is he seemed to have a gift for languages. If I understand correctly, he learned Chinese, but less people think that's one language. They're various dialects, and he learned multiple dialects, and he also learned Vietnamese, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, that was another one because he fell in love with a Vietnamese woman, and so in order to communicate with her, she also speaks very good English now, but yes, his aptitude for language is really remarkable, and it is strange. We don't see it that often, and when I go out and talk about the book in different meetings and whatnot, and see him, and then I play audio of him speaking in Chinese, and he just breaks right from like a typical Boston accent into a very Chinese, Mandarin, Cantonese accent. And he does it so well, it's quite impressive, and it is something that you just don't see that often. So again, I think that's one of the amazing parts of the story, and what is so intriguing is how a 15-year-old kid can drop out of high school and learn to speak Chinese, and then run a very successful drug business, illegally, of course. But he had an operation going from Florida to Massachusetts, and made millions of dollars over several years before they were able to catch him. So he does have a brain. He's a very intelligent guy. He has no remorse and no real regret. The FBI that I spoke with, they used the word psychopath. I wasn't sure of that for myself, medically and what psychologically what it actually means. But when I interviewed him, I was struck by the fact that when he talked about missing his wife and daughter, who I should add, he's not married and did not adopt the daughter, but that's how he refers to them. He cried. I mean, they looked like real tears to me, and he was very emotional and very upset. And I thought, well, that's not really a psychopath or anything, but I don't know when I'm being played and what's an act or anything like that. But I definitely saw a guy wrestling with loneliness and afraid that he would spend the next 20 years without having a chance to see them, and that he was losing them in his life. The rest of the part about prison and all that didn't seem to bother him, but that part he did get very emotional about.
Now, in terms of what he did before he rose to the heights of power, he was an enforcer, wasn't he?
Yes, I mean, that's really what it started as, and without getting too stereotypical, he is quite a bit bigger than most of the guys in the Asian gang, and he was lifting weights and doing steroids, and so, when I met him, he was still big and strong. I'd put him in the 6'2", 250, 270 range or something like that. And he does, have an intimidating look about him. He's a handsome guy, but he can stare you down. There's no doubt about that. And I've since heard stories from other people who knew him when he was on the streets, and he was an exceptionally good fighter. Like I asked him, I said, "Did you ever lose a fight?" And he laughed. He thought that was funny. There's no way he would ever lose a fight. So, but that's what he did at the beginning, was that he was a collector. That's how the Chinese gang operates to some extent. The businesses that start there borrow money, and then for the rest of their existence, they have to pay money back, protection money as well as just the debt. And if they were late in payment, then John would go collect it, and every once in a while he'd have to commit some sort of violent act. Sometimes it was against the restaurant, where he'd pull down chandeliers or break windows and things like that. And other times it was something a little bit more physical than that. I asked him if he had ever killed anybody, and he said, "I can't answer that." And I said to him, "Well, that's interesting, because if you ask me that question, I'd be able to answer no very easily," and stuff. So I don't know what that means, if he wants me to believe he's done something like that, or if he legitimately has. But he did not talk in detail about anything overly violent. Most of his conversation with me was about how he built the drug trade that he was involved in, and why it was so successful, and why the cops were dirty and things like that. That was his version of the story.
It would seem like to me, for the Asian gang or any gang, he was very versatile. It kind of strikes me, to use a sports analogy, was a 5-tool player. He could do a little bit of everything. He had this strength. He had the looks. He had the language skills. He could probably float well between these worlds. And I'm guessing that he was a liaison to I'm guessing, you tell me, non-Asian gangs. So he really I could see how he could serve a very unique role.
Yes, and it was, the compliments, there are plenty for him. I mean, sometimes when we talk about a criminal and a violent one and selling drugs and it ruins people's lives and things, it's odd to say nice things about that person. But he is very intelligent and very hardworking. And to the extent that somebody selling drugs can be he was very honest, and I think that helped him in his relationships throughout. He talked to me a little bit about that he wasn't looking to make all the money in a deal. You would get yours, I would get mine, he would get his, and that would be fine. And so I think because he treated people fairly and was honest about, I'm going to do this, and then he would actually do it, that helped him quite a bit. And yes, there was some crossover from the Chinese gang that he was in with some of the other criminal enterprises that were involved, and that's when he started to spread himself out a little bit, to ultimately, after half dozen years or so, he was less involved in the Chinese gang in Chinatown because his boss didn't like to sell drugs, thought that brought problems, also didn't like drugs in Chinatown itself. And so when John decided to go in that direction, he had to find other associates. And I guess not surprisingly, he found many of those associates the first time he went to prison. So our prison system, I discovered, is lacking in some ways, because it seemed like every time John went in, he came out with more connections and more opportunities to do worse things. And that's what he continued to do. And it makes me wonder if when he gets out, and I think it's another 17 years or so that he's in, when he gets out, I think you just go right back to doing that kind of thing. I don't know what will change him over 17 years, but right now it's about all he knows how to do, and he seems to find ways to do it while he's in jail.
White Devil, that was one nickname, and if I understand correctly, John had another nickname.
Oh, I'm forgetting it at the moment.
Is it Bak Gwai? Is that the correct?
Oh, Bak Gwai, yes. That's the Chinese pronunciation of White Devil. And you're right, it's Bak Gwai. And he's upset about that nickname because the Chinese actually don't have a word for devil. It really means white ghost. But then when the FBI were referring to him in media reports and things like that, they'd call him the White Devil. And when I wrote the book and I asked my manager, I said, so what does John think of it? And he said, well, he likes it. He says it's good, but kind of makes him look like a bad guy. I said, well, I did my best to write about him fairly. But yeah, when you do these types of things, you end up being a bad guy. But he's offended by the nickname White Devil because he doesn't think he's a bad guy. And he was at least mildly upset with the book because it made him look like a bad guy. And a good portion of our conversation, I was raised Catholic, 12 years of parochial school, so the whole religion and God and afterlife is something that has interested me. And so I asked John about that, and he made a very vehement defense that God loves him and he is going to heaven because God is the one who put him on this path, and he was successful, and he did what he needed to do, and he was good at it and used the skills and the intelligence that God gave him. And so he's a fairly religious person, not one denomination or anything, but definitely spiritual, and definitely believes that despite the crimes he's committed and the lives that he may have hurt, that he is going to heaven. So I let him pretty much tell you that in the book. I put quotation marks at the beginning of a paragraph and then 4 paragraphs later, end quote, because I wanted him to be able to tell his philosophy without me trying to interpret it so much. And he is eloquent, and so I think it makes for a good read in that respect. But the moral, religious philosophy of John Willis is definitely in the pages, and you get to try to figure out if you agree with him or not so much.
Now, he specialized in drugs. What type of drugs?
Well, he was selling OxyContin. He would go to these pill mills, basically, in Florida. We're talking about the early 2000s here, where apparently things were like the wild, wild west. You just go to a doctor and get a prescription, and then you can fill it at every other store, to where, you know, a half dozen people who fly down to Florida can get their hands on 40, 60, 80,000 pills, and then they fly those back to Massachusetts and they're sold. So that's kind of what got him in trouble there, is that as he branched out and was contacting more people, they were using burner phones and things, but they definitely, you know, had more conversations that the FBI were wiretapping. And even when he spoke Chinese, that was part of what took so long with the process, is that things had to be interpreted. And so the FBI were using people who could do that, translate. And finally, they felt like they had enough. And I would say to you that, you know, the case that the FBI had was strong, but not impenetrable. It was a solid case, but they really didn't get him, you know, with his hand in the cookie jar or anything like that. But they ended up putting some pressure on his girlfriend/wife, and in order to keep her out of jail, he pled guilty, and several others did as well. And so he ended up getting 20 years. But yeah, it was OxyContin that he was selling, you know, for millions of dollars total, over about a 6-year period that sent him to jail for this last time.
When you do something like this, you have to have some favorite stories or anecdotes, things that happen involving the protagonist, involving John. Do you have any favorite stories from this book?
Yes. I mean, like I say, I think my favorite story about writing the book is just sitting across a table with somebody like this. It's not something that I've done in the past. And so to be sent into a room when I go down to Cumberland, Maryland, to the prison, and I'm sent into a small room, I'd say 6 by 8 or something like that. There's a small table and 2 chairs, and that's it. And they told me, the security guy told me to just sit down, and I did. And next thing I know, in a giant orange jumpsuit is this, you know, large man I've never met before, and he walks in, shakes my hand. He's not wearing shackles or anything like that, and the security guy walks out. So now it's just the 2 of us in this room, and we're chatting away. I'm recording everything. And the second day that I talked to him, I was going to fly away from Baltimore back home. And so I'm interviewing him, and I'm trying to get as much as I can because this is my last real chance to talk to him. And after about 3 hours or so, I look at my watch and I look outside to the windows behind me, and there's like 4 inches of snow on the ground. And so I said to him, like, when the hell were you going to tell me that it was snowing out? And he laughed, and I was like, so now all of a sudden I had the difficulty of getting back to the airport and flying out. But just in that meeting, too, I wanted to say that the first day I interviewed him, the security guy came back and like rapped on the window and just signaled to me with his forefinger, you know, like, you got to get out. And I said, oh, he's telling me I got to go. And so I stood up, shook hands with John, walked out. The next day I came back and he said, I just want you to know I really ripped into that security guy for the way he treated you yesterday. And I said, I don't know what you mean. He said, well, I thought that was pretty disrespectful, the way he just like waved his hand for you to leave and everything. I mean, that's not how you treat somebody. I was like, oh, okay. Thank you. Because I was like, I didn't think that was disrespectful. But I would say to you that if in his mind, the slightest of slights, that disrespectful, that's kind of why he got into so many fights, because he would confront anybody over anything, and I didn't think anything of that. I thought, well, you're the security, you're the boss, you're the one telling me what to do, of course I'll just leave. But John was very upset at how I was treated that day.
Well, it's interesting you said that, but I would look at the flip side of that. His sensitivity to those things, probably within that culture, was very important. So he watched everything that he did to make sure it was respectful. So I'm guessing that kind of sensitivity really helped him succeed in those gangs.
Yeah, and I do think that the rules are very clear to him. They're not that clear to me. I think the world is very gray, and I think John sees it as very black and white. There's a right way to behave and a right way to deal with people and a right thing to say and a right thing to do, and he walks that side of the line in his mind. And so, like even when you press him on the selling drugs, I go, but when you sell the drugs, you're hurting people's lives, and people die from it, and go broke with it, and end up on the streets. And he says they have personal choice. I'm not forcing them to sell to buy the drugs, so that's on them. I have no guilt in it, no part in it. Is what he really thinks. He's just a businessman, and this is the product. And if you want it, that's on you. And if you don't want it, he's not pressuring you to. So he can really, wash his hands and say I'm clean, despite the fact that what he was doing was definitely, impacting people's lives to the worse.
Did you have an opportunity to speak with anybody connected with the gangs that he was in, or anybody on that side of life, to see how he's viewed in the rear view mirror, so to speak, since he's out of commission?
Yes, there was one guy who was in the gang and is trying to be an actor in Hollywood right now, and I was able to reach out to him.
Isn't everybody?
And, so he probably can bring some realism to whatever role he might have. But he was a nice guy, also a young kid who got started at 16 years old or more, and was able to extricate himself and move on. But he talked a lot about the time he spent with John and how intimidating John could be if you started to see him seethe or something like that. You wanted to get the hell out of the way. And means of, breaking a bottle, and so you've got the glass there that you're threatening somebody with, and those types of things. But he spoke glowingly of John in terms of how quickly he was able to grasp what was required, how willing he was to do whatever was required, and the respect that he commanded from everybody else that he was involved with. Because the thing I'd say about John is there's about 3 stories, I think, of gunfights where they're down by the Boston Garden or something, and there's gunshots going back and forth across the streets, and that definitely happened in New York as well. But when I read other media accounts of other things that were happening with gangs and the machine guns that would come out and the mass killings that occurred, things like, I don't have stories like that from John. So he doesn't seem to be, and he would tell you that, the influx of more people from Vietnam than China was the problem. But I don't know the whole backstory on that kind of stuff. But his violence did seem to be more man-to-man, one-on-one, with fists and physical intimidation. There's one story where he fired a gun for the first time and was shot at for the first time, and then he doesn't go into great detail about how often he carried a weapon from that point forward or how many times he had to use it. I don't know that his use of violence gets to the murderous stage, despite his vagueness to the question when I asked it and everything. But I think he was more a hands-on, physically intimidating and scare the heck out of you type of an enforcer.
Now, book has obviously been successful and well received. Motion picture, possibly?
Yes, that's one you always wait for. And I was sent a movie script that was written by a gentleman named James Gray, and it was outstanding. And I'm like, okay, this is terrific. And then the contract ran out for the story with the movie studio. I think they had it for 2 years or something like that. And so then it was picked up. I think it left Warner Brothers and got picked up by Sony. and Sony was trying to turn it into a television series. And then another gentleman was writing that one. His name was Robert Kamen, who wrote Karate Kid and a handful of other things, including the Taken series that I almost left out. And so I said to him on the phone one day, I go, so if they're hiring you, they're pretty serious about this. And he said, yes, I can humbly say that if they're going to pay me the kind of money they're paying me, that they have high expectations for this as a television series. But I can also tell you, I just wrote something for ABC, and everybody loved it, and there was a lot of enthusiasm, and it's never going to make air. So it's like, well, that's the way the TV and movie industry works, I think. And so I've been sitting back for the past year or so waiting to hear if anything's going on with the television series, and it hasn't yet. But, if people go out and buy the book and it becomes this major bestseller, then it'll push the television series right along. And so...
Well, you can tell you're a broadcasting pro because that's a perfect setup. So,
that's what I was doing.
So I will not let that pass. Where can people find this fine book?
Well, Amazon.com is where everybody finds it now, and it's out in bookstores, things like that, and I still make public appearances in New England and whatnot. So check your social media and find out when I'm out there. But yeah, Amazon.com's the best place.
And the book is White Devil, the true story of the first white Asian crime boss. Our guest has been Bob Halloran. Bob, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us on another edition of The Crime Scene. And please tell your friends, I think this is one of those podcasts that doesn't get enough attention. And we want to grow the audience if we're going to continue to put the new episodes on the free side. It's important that we grow the audience, or else we'll tuck it back into the Plus Club. Still going to do the show for sure, but it's one of those things where we go where the audience tells us they want us to go. And if the audience doesn't tune in, we say, well, we'll instead of doing this every week, we'll do it once a month and put it over on the Plus Club. So please, if you enjoy the show, please share with your friends, tell them about it, and spread the good word. We thank you so much for tuning in to Crime Scene. We'll talk to you next time. Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.